Welcome to Stories Room. Enjoy listening and don't forget to subscribe. The bedroom door flew open with a crash, and Emily jolted at the sudden noise. Her heart seemed to stop for a split second when she saw Josh, her husband, on the threshold, his face distorted by rage. A mixture of hurt, jealousy, and unforgiving anger blazed in his eyes. Only a moment earlier, she had been lying in her lover Richard's arms, still trembling from the sinful ecstasy they had shared. "You," Josh muttered in a hoarse voice, breathing heavily as though he had just run a marathon. "God, Emily, how could you?" His gaze darted between the naked bodies of the two lovers caught in their own illicit passion. Emily's legs felt like rubber. She was paralyzed, her chest tight with horror, guilt, and the panic of what might happen next. Richard leaped up from the bed, trying to grab his jeans, but it was too late. Josh's fist lashed out. A bedside lamp fell and shattered with a dull thud as the blow landed square on Richard's temple. He barely managed a muffled groan. Emily screamed, struggling to get between the men, but Josh, blinded by fury, shoved her aside, sending her crashing against the corner of the bed. Her vision went dark for an instant as she lost consciousness. When Emily came to, it was all over. Glass shards were scattered across the floor, along with the fragments of what had once seemed like an ideal life. Josh stood, fists clenched and bloody, his breath ragged and trembling with a terrifying resolve. "Don't think I'm going to leave it at this," he hissed. "You just signed your own death warrant." Emily couldn't understand exactly what he meant, but there was something dreadful in his eyes, an intention to keep going, to plan something far worse. Richard, swaying, managed to get up. Blood trickled from the wound on his temple. Josh cast him a contemptuous glance, then walked out of the room. The sound of the front door slamming shut echoed like a death sentence. The silence that followed felt ominous. And with that, Emily's perfect life ended in a way that almost cost someone their life. But what seemed like a single outburst of wrath soon evolved into a meticulously plotted revenge, and this was only the opening act of what lay ahead. To understand how it all spiraled toward this destructive explosion, we need to go back 6 months, when everything still seemed relatively calm. Josh and Emily had been married for 4 years. At first glance, they appeared to be a harmonious couple. Josh was ambitious, coldly logical, somewhat cynical, in his climb up the financial industry ladder. Emily led a more creative life, working as an art director at a small agency, developing advertising concepts and dabbling in illustration. They would eat dinner together most evenings, watch some random TV shows in the background. There was a certain routine in their life, but neither seemed to complain aloud. Yet beneath that facade of mutual composure and quiet routines, tension simmered. Emily felt stifled by her husband's indifference. He rarely took an interest in her inner world, even though he provided a stable household and financial security. Josh practically lived for his work, reports, and endless business meetings. All of this weighed on Emily. Deep down, she longed for passion, for some emotional tempest so lacking in their placid marriage. Even their sex life had turned into a predictable ritual, a once-a-week obligatory punctuation to mark marital duty. So when she accidentally ran into Richard, a freelance photographer hired to shoot one of her agency's corporate events, her heart fluttered with a forgotten thrill. They exchanged only a few words that evening, yet she sensed a mutual attraction. Emily couldn't pinpoint precisely what drew her to Richard. Perhaps it was the sparkle in his eyes, or maybe the subtle irony in his every gesture. She found herself wanting to know more about him, about his worldview. Little did she suspect how quickly this desire would ignite a blaze capable of burning her old life to the ground. It began innocently enough with work-related texts. Richard would send her the photos he'd taken. Emily would suggest ideas for design concepts. But soon their messages turned more personal, talks about books, music, creative aspirations. She discovered that Richard was passionate about travel, nature photography, and portrait work. His portraits had a captivating sensuality, a special way of depicting feminine beauty. "I'd love to see myself through his lens," Emily thought. That notion, naive as it might have seemed, stirred inside her, refusing to let go. One day, Richard proposed a test photo shoot, under the guise of helping him figure out the best approach for working with the agency. Emily accepted, a small thrill flickering in her chest. And so she found herself in an evening studio session where the two of them were alone. The studio lights flickered, leaving the rest of the space dim. Richard busied himself with the camera, occasionally glancing at Emily with a smile that hinted at more than a photographer's interest in a model. Speaking gently in a soothing voice, he gave her simple directions. Look over there. Turn slightly to the right. Wrap your arms around yourself like you want to hide from the whole world. During the shoot, Emily felt transported into a new realm, one detached from everyday monotony. She posed, feeling a long-dormant sensuality reawaken inside her. At one point, Richard moved closer to adjust the lighting, his sleeve brushing against her shoulder. It was the slightest touch, yet Emily recoiled as though an electric current had run through her. She caught a glimpse of desire in his dark eyes. They finished a couple of hours later. Richard walked her out to a taxi, and as Emily turned around by the car, their gazes locked. Neither spoke, but both felt that dangerous spark. From there, it was only a matter of time before passion would overwhelm them. Their next meeting was at a cafe downtown. Emily told Josh she needed to stay late at work. He merely nodded, buried in his reports. Strangely enough, lying to him felt like a relief. Clearly, he wasn't even curious enough to ask for details. In that cafe, Emily and Richard found a secluded booth, partially hidden behind a low divider and decorative plants. Conversation flowed naturally, starting with mundane topics: work, photography, mundane office life, then more personal subjects. After a while, Emily slipped onto the bench next to him. He took her hand, carefully interlacing their fingers. Even that small gesture sent sparks through her. "Listen," Richard said quietly, leaning close to her ear. "I don't want this to be just talk. Whatever's happening between us is powerful. Maybe we should allow ourselves something more." Emily knew he wasn't talking about a meaningless fling. She saw genuine longing in his eyes, and she wanted it too. But the words, "I'm married," never made it past her throat. For the first time in her life, her marital status didn't stop her. It only pumped more adrenaline into her veins. She kissed him in response, tentative but unmistakable. Richard pressed his lips to hers gently, as though seeking permission. She opened her mouth, letting their tongues intertwine. In that moment, the world around them faded. No more cafe chatter, no more glances from passers-by. There was just this unexpected, searing kiss that made her pulse hammer in her ears. That night, Emily returned home, fighting a trembling in her chest. Remarkably, Josh paid little attention, already preparing for bed. Her fear was mingled with bitterness. Did he truly care so little about her absence? Emily and Richard's affair escalated quickly. They found the boldest ways to steal moments together. During lunch breaks, under the guise of business trips, or after-hours meetings. Josh hardly questioned it, too preoccupied with his career. With each rendezvous, passion flared ever higher, driving them further past the boundaries of what was permissible. The first time they slept together happened in a small design studio Richard was renting for photo projects. Emily arrived under the pretense of reviewing new images. The moment the door closed, their bodies were drawn to each other like magnets. A gentle meeting of hands gave way to a wild wave of desire. Richard kissed her with an urgency that Emily reciprocated, awakened by a depth of hunger she hadn't felt in her marriage for a long time. He moved from her lips to her neck, unclasping her blouse, while she fumbled with the buttons of his shirt, her heart pounding harder at every undone button. When their bare skin finally met, Emily exhaled shakily, as if the entire universe had converged in that room. His hands traveled over her waist and hips, his fingertips grazing her skin, coaxing her arch her body in response. She let out soft, quivering moans. For a fleeting moment, she caught herself thinking that just yesterday, such behavior would have been unimaginable, sleeping with another man, and with such raw intensity. But she brushed the thought aside and surrendered to the heat of Richard's breath against her skin. That first time was fast, desperate, as if every minute they had was stolen from reality. The subtle thrill of a dirty secret only heightened the fire. When a wave of climax rippled through Emily, she gasped, consumed by pleasure she hadn't felt in so long. She realized she could never give up this passion again. Perhaps never. During this affair, Emily returned home later and later, showing little interest in Josh's schedule. Josh watched her slip into a new life with a grim anxiety. But rather than openly confront her, he chose to gather information methodically. He refused to start a fight without fully knowing who and what he was dealing with. Peeking at her phone one day, he spotted chats with this Richard the photographer, and something within him snapped. But instead of confronting his wife, Josh hired a private investigator, determined to beat Emily at her own game, to catch her off guard, collect undeniable evidence, and punish them both. In his mind, cold, calculating ideas of revenge began to form. Meanwhile, Emily and Richard's relationship bloomed. They were filled with a craving to explore each other's bodies and souls, crossing all lines of propriety. Sometimes they met in Richard's car, parked in a secluded alley, where the smallest kisses would grow into feverish embraces in the back seat. The sweetness of their deception only fueled Emily's desire. She morphed from a dutiful wife into a reckless lover, ready to give herself to him right there in the car. One time, they booked a cheap motel room on the city outskirts. The room was tiny, with a sagging mattress and a view of a depressing courtyard. Still, it felt like a sanctuary where they could unleash their lust without hesitation. The moment they shut the door, Emily pressed Richard against the wall, ripping open his shirt, kissing his neck wildly. They wasted no time. Passion overwhelmed them. The half-darkness seemed only to intensify the thrill. Each kiss, each caress was reflected in a side mirror, inciting even bolder fantasies. Richard lifted Emily up, setting her on the edge of the bed so he could run his hands over her thighs. She breathed in sharp gasps, every touch making her shiver with anticipation. In those minutes, they seemed to forget the real world. No husband, no rules, just a raging, near-animal desire. By the time Emily came with a loud, desperate moan, she realized she had never felt such raw intensity, not even in her early days with Josh. But eventually, every secret is exposed, and theirs was revealed with a thunderous crash. The private detective had been tailing Emily for a week, collecting photos, video footage, even messages. One day, Josh orchestrated a trap. He had the detective call Richard under the pretense of a new lucrative job in a country house. Emily was invited along, thinking it was a location for a photography presentation. They arrived at the house around the same time, using keys given by this client. It was a deserted cottage, quiet, empty. Realizing they were alone, they chuckled at the thought of a whole house to themselves. Soon enough, in one of the upstairs bedrooms with a large bed and a view of the garden, they were lost in each other once again. This was the moment Josh chose to burst in. The door crashed open, and behind him stood the detective, phone camera in hand, capturing it all as evidence. Emily screamed, scrambling to cover herself with a blanket, while Richard reached for his pants, stunned. Josh didn't need more confirmation. His eyes blazed with hatred, and in one hand he clutched a gun he had bought illegally. Emily froze at the sight of that cold, lethal symbol of rage. "You think I was too stupid to notice?" Josh's voice was dangerously soft. "A little adventure behind my back? So that's how it is." He stepped forward, and Richard lunged to disarm him. They grappled. Emily tried to intervene, but the detective grabbed her shoulders to hold her back. Then came a single shot, heavy, menacing. Richard staggered, clutching his left forearm as blood spurted to the floor. Outside the window, birds fluttered away in alarm, screeching in panic. Josh, horrified at what he'd done, suddenly loosened his grip on the gun. The detective snatched it away, and Emily rushed to Richard, pressing frantically at his wound. "Call an ambulance," she stammered, looking at the detective. "Please." Josh stood as though petrified by the magnitude of his actions. His fury dissolved, replaced by shock. The atmosphere was suffocating with tension, only broken by the labored breathing of everyone present. There was no going back. Vengeance had become real, and its consequences were now a matter of law and time. Richard survived. The bullet went clean through without hitting a major artery, but the dramatic story spread everywhere, among colleagues and acquaintances. Emily became the subject of vicious gossip and blame. After all, it was her affair that had led to violence. Josh was arrested for attempted murder, facing a potentially lengthy prison term. The detective who had helped set up the trap testified that Josh had planned it all to catch the lovers in the act. Emily was consumed by guilt and shame that Josh's actions were monstrous. She knew if it weren't for her deceit, perhaps none of this would have happened. Richard spent several weeks in the hospital. They spoke on the phone, each call leaving Emily in tears. He tried to console her, saying he didn't regret their love even though it almost cost him his life. He spoke of love that transcends all danger, though his voice held a tinge of uncertainty. Could he truly forgive Emily for what her husband had done? When Emily finally visited him, the room was sterile and white, unsettling in its loneliness. Richard lay in bed with his arm bandaged. On seeing Emily, he smiled, but it was a smile colored by sadness rather than pure joy. She approached, took his good hand in hers, and pressed her forehead against his palm. "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." "No," Richard shook his head. "It's neither your fault nor mine. Your husband thought he had the right to do what he did. I can't forget that shot. But I know one thing. I love you. And that's stronger than fear." His words tore at Emily's raw nerves. Love? She no longer knew what that meant. Desire, lust, or something deeper. Too much pain, blood, and darkness had tainted their relationship. Still, she recognized she couldn't live without him. His voice, his touch, and his gaze were now her lifeline, though it came with harrowing memories. While the case was ongoing, Josh remained in custody. He tried to reach Emily through his lawyer, but she refused to see him, paralyzed by horror and revulsion at what he had done. Yes, she had betrayed him, but he had retaliated not with divorce or argument, but with the intent to kill. Eventually, Emily mustered the courage to speak with him. In the visitation room under harsh fluorescent lights, they sat across from each other at a narrow table. Josh looked older by a decade, unkempt hair, dark circles under his eyes, trembling fingers. "I just wanted to punish you," he said, voice shaking. "To make you suffer. I don't know what came over me. Thinking about another man touching you, about you giving him the kind of passion you stopped giving me, it drove me insane." Emily listened silently, hating him for nearly killing Richard yet feeling only a profound emptiness. "You realize it's over, don't you?" she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "Even if they go easy on you, even if you somehow get off, there's nothing left between us." Josh looked up at her, regret and heartbreak in his eyes. "Yeah, I know. But remember this. You destroyed our marriage. I was just striking back." Emily clenched her fists, biting her lip to hold back tears. Part of her recognized there was truth to his words. She had indeed shattered their marriage with her infidelity. But she also knew it was far more complicated than just that, given how little real love was left in their relationship. They said nothing else to each other. A month later, Richard was discharged from the hospital, though he still needed rehab for his arm. Emily arranged a small apartment for him in a quiet neighborhood, away from people who might recognize them. She moved in with him, unwilling to return to the marital home filled with haunting memories. Life, it seemed, was starting from scratch. But it was no simple matter to escape the shock and the constant tension. Emily often woke in the night screaming, reliving the memory of the gunshot, the blood, and Josh's fury-twisted face. Richard would hold her close, stroking her hair, whispering that she was safe. But he, too, sometimes trembled in his sleep, recalling how close he had come to death. To find a glimmer of happiness, they flung themselves back into passion, no longer as clandestine lovers, but as partners who didn't have to hide. Yet that passion carried something new, a trace of the danger and adrenaline they had once experienced. Sometimes, as she felt Richard's hands on her, Emily flashed back to the first sparks of their secret affair, which only inflamed her further. One evening, they decided to celebrate his recovery with a bottle of wine. The mood was warm and intense with anticipation. Emily wore a tight-fitting dress, almost no underwear beneath, her eyes gleaming with desire and a heartbeat like a hunted animal's. Noticing her mischievous glance, Richard stepped closer, his hand sliding around her waist, gripping her hips so firmly she gasped. "You remind me of a wild cat I once photographed on safari," he whispered with a hint of amusement. Beauty and danger rolled into one. "And you like playing with danger, right?" she shot back, parting her lips. Rather than answer with words, he dipped his head to nuzzle her neck, letting his lips trace a path along her collarbone. She shivered, her entire body tightening with anticipation. His hands tugged down the straps of her dress, and the fabric slipped off her shoulders, baring her breasts. He continued kissing her skin, moving downward until she let out a low moan and pulled him closer, her fingers threading through his hair. They made their way to the couch, never breaking free from each other's arms. The fall was gentle, but the passion scorched them both. Their kisses were deep, tongues meeting hungrily, breath growing louder as they shed their clothes. Richard undid his pants, tossing them aside without stopping his kisses. She opened her legs, lifting her hips to feel him more closely, the soft gasps turning into louder moans that drowned out even the wind outside. Their lovemaking intensified, sometimes rushing, sometimes slowing to savor every sensation. As Emily reached her second climax, she cried out, digging her nails into Richard's back. In that raw cry lay pain, desire, fear, and relief, all the tangled emotions of the last few months. Richard clung to her, letting their bodies move in sync until their ragged breathing became a single shared rhythm. When it finally subsided, they lay there, covered in sweat, entwined in each other's arms, granted a moment's peace from their nightmares. A few weeks later, Josh's court hearing took place. He partially admitted guilt, insisting he only meant to scare Emily's lover. Yet the evidence showed otherwise. He had come armed, intending real harm. The jury and the judge did not accept his excuses about temporary insanity, though they did factor in mitigating circumstances, no prior convictions, and the provocation of his wife's affair. The verdict was harsh, multiple years in prison. Josh bowed his head as he heard the sentence, realizing his life was torn in two, before and after. Emily sat in the courtroom, hands trembling with conflicting emotions. She didn't want him locked away forever, despite being horrified by what he'd done. But it was no longer in her control. Richard was cleared of wrongdoing as the victim of attempted homicide. Stepping outside after the trial, he and Emily paused in the hallway. She looked at him as if hoping his eyes would show her the path forward. How would they live from now on? Richard placed his hand over hers. "We have to put this behind us, Emily. Josh got what was coming to him, but let's not live in the past. We both got hurt, but we're together now." She bit her lip. "I know. I just can't stop feeling guilty. And what about us? What's next?" Richard pulled her into a gentle embrace, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Whatever we choose. Let's build our life from the ground up." They rented another apartment, brighter, cozier in a better neighborhood, to sever ties with the dark memories. Emily quit her job at the agency, unable to keep working where her fateful affair had begun. Instead, she pursued freelance projects in design and illustration while assisting Richard with his photography. In time, they decided to go to the sea, hoping the distant waves would soothe their scars. Under the palm trees, listening to the gentle rush of the tide, Richard took photos of Emily at sunset. The images were both tender and provocative. She wore almost nothing, her hair blown by the wind, daring in her gaze. They radiated the freedom she had never known while married to Josh. At their hotel, they made love nearly every night, without fear of discovery. This intimacy was an outlet for the deep emotions that still weighed on them. One particular night, with warm moonlight spilling through the window, Emily lay on her stomach and looked back at Richard over her shoulder, lifting her hips. He immediately understood her unspoken signal, her body calling out. He came closer, pressing his body onto hers. She parted her lips in a soft moan. There was no need to hide or rush now. He kissed down her back, his lips tracing each vertebra, her skin tingling with each brush. She surrendered to the rising pulse of desire. As waves of pleasure engulfed them both, Emily cried out his name, a fervent prayer of sorts. In those moaning gasps lay her entire journey, from illicit betrayal to a new, precarious, but intensely desired love. Some might call Emily and Richard's story unfair, since they effectively trampled on marital vows and triggered a tragic, bloody scene of revenge. Life doesn't always fit neatly within moral codes. Sometimes promises and rules crumble under the weight of uncontrollable desire. Yes, a steep price was paid. One man lost his freedom and nearly his life. Another woman destroyed her marriage and rightly faced guilt. Yet in the end, Emily and Richard had a chance to begin anew. They were bound not only by the grim memory of violent vengeance, but also by a genuine bond of affection. This love was tinged with pain and recklessness, yet lit by the possibility that, after betrayal and blood, people can still find real closeness. Somewhere, perhaps on that distant shore, they will sit side by side, remembering how it all began with a single glance at a corporate reception. In their minds, the sound of the gunshot and the shattered mirror in a stranger's cottage will never fully fade, nor will the blood on that shirt or the terror of nearly losing each other. But this story isn't just about how infidelity ruins lives. It's also about how love can rise from the ashes. The future remains uncertain. Dark clouds linger from the past. Yet in the hush of night, held in each other's arms, they find the courage to keep going, heedless of judgment. Sometimes, to find true passion, one must pass through deception, loss, even mortal danger. The question is whether they can preserve that passion without further battles and bloodshed. For now, wrapped in each other's warmth, they're not searching for all the answers. Their hearts beat as one, and the whisper of the wind reminds them, life goes on. And in that continuity, they are ready to protect their love against all fears and accusations. That's the end of our story. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date on new stories and share this video so others can discover these great stories too.